The road into Holt's Crossing was nothing but two wheel ruts pressed into the red earth by years of wagons that knew better than to linger. Ruth Calloway had no such luxury. She sat on the bench of the mail coach with her hands folded in her lap and her back straight, the way her mother had taught her, the way a woman holds herself when she has nothing left but her posture. Outside the window, the Colorado high desert rolled past in shades of ochre and sage, beautiful in the way that hard things often are, indifferent to whether you admired it or not. She was 23 years old. She had 41 cents, a small leather satchel, and a certificate from the Denver Business College that testified, in careful official script, to her proficiency in bookkeeping, accounting, and commercial correspondence. She also had a letter, folded into thirds, and worn soft at the creases from being read too many times. It was from a man named Caleb Aldrich, owner of the Aldrich Timber Concern, who had placed an advertisement in the Denver Courier seeking a house manager and account keeper for a working property outside of Holt's Crossing. The pay was modest. Room and board were included. He had not asked for references from a husband. That last part was what had made her write back. The land fraud that had taken her family's farm in the foothills east of Pueblo had not announced itself with cruelty. It had come quietly, in the form of a county surveyor named Garrett Finch, who had arrived one spring morning with his instruments and his pleasant smile and his fraudulent chain. 3 weeks later, a man from the land office had ridden out to inform her father that the boundary of the Calloway property, according to the official recorded plat, did not include the south 40 acres where the farmhouse stood. It did not include the well. It did not include the barn. Her father had died before the appeal could be heard, and Ruth had spent the next 8 months learning exactly what it meant to fight a bureaucratic lie with nothing but the truth and no money to hire the men who traffic in it. She had lost. So here she was, 41 cents and a piece of paper that said she was good with numbers. The coach pulled to a stop in the center of a town that was less a town than a promise. A general store, a livery, a small church with a crooked steeple, and a saloon that appeared to be doing the most reliable business of all. Ruth climbed down before the driver could offer a hand, her boot heels finding the dry ground with a soft thud. A man was leaning against the post of the general store, watching the coach arrive with the patient stillness of someone accustomed to waiting on the land's schedule rather than his own. He was tall, broad across the chest in the way of a man who felled trees rather than managed them from a desk, with dark hair sun-streaked at the temples and a jaw that had not met a razor in several days. He looked at her the way men in the West looked at things they were assessing, not unkindly, but with a directness that left no room for pretense. "Miss Calloway?" he asked. His voice was low and even. "Mr. Aldrich," she replied, holding his gaze without flinching. He nodded once, picked up her satchel from beside her before she could reach it, and walked toward a wagon without another word. She followed. She had the distinct impression that he was a man who considered most conversation a form of extravagance. The ride to the timber concern took 40 minutes along a track that climbed steadily into the pines. As the elevation rose, the air changed cooler, thick with the resinous smell of Douglas fir. The timber operation spread across the upper valley in controlled sections, the sound of distant axes and the occasional groan of a falling tree carrying clearly in the mountain air. The main house was a 2-story structure of solid construction, built from the timber of the land itself, with a covered porch and windows that caught the afternoon light and held it. A girl of about 9 stood on the porch steps, watching their approach with enormous dark eyes. She had Caleb Aldrich's coloring and a more careful version of his stillness, as though she had learned early that the world bore watching. "My daughter, Eliza," Caleb said, his voice softening by a fraction that he didn't appear to notice. The girl looked at Ruth with the frank assessment of a child who has had to form opinions of adults quickly and trust those opinions to survive. She said nothing. Ruth looked back at her with equal seriousness, and after a moment, gave a small nod, not the condescending nod adults give children, but the kind exchanged between people who understand one another's situation. Something shifted in the girl's expression. Not quite a smile, but an opening. Inside, Caleb Aldrich showed her the house with the efficiency of a man moving through a checklist. The kitchen, the larder, the main room, the small room off the back that would be hers. Then he stopped at the door of a room at the front of the house, the one with the best light, and his hand rested on the doorframe for a moment before he opened it. It was an office. And it was, in the most charitable possible terms, a catastrophe of good intentions. Papers covered every surface. Receipts were stacked beside contracts that had been used as bookmarks in ledgers that were themselves stacked on top of correspondence that had never been answered. There were 3 coffee cups, all at different stages of abandonment, and a desk calendar that was 8 months behind. "The accounts," Caleb said, with the tone of a man confessing to a priest. He looked at the room, then at her. "My wife kept them. She passed 2 years ago." Ruth stood in the doorway and looked at the accumulated evidence of a capable man drowning slowly in the one place he had never learned to breathe. "I'll see to it," she said. He left her there. She heard him walk back through the house, heard the front door open and close, heard his boots on the porch steps heading back toward the work that he understood. She stood in the center of the paper storm and breathed in through her nose. Then she rolled up her sleeves. That first evening, Caleb and Eliza sat down to supper in the kitchen to find a meal on the table that was simple but properly made roasted venison from the larder, cornbread, and boiled greens with salt pork. Caleb washed up and sat. Eliza watched the new woman from her chair with the focused attention of someone taking notes. Ruth served them and then stepped back toward the stove, her hands folded, waiting for the meal to conclude so she could clean the kitchen and determine her own portion from whatever remained. She had learned this rhythm in her months as a boarding house cook's helper in Pueblo. You served first, you ate last, and you ate quietly, and you were grateful for it. She was watching the window and thinking about the accounts when she heard the chair scrape. She looked up, expecting Caleb to rise and leave the table. Instead, he stood, crossed to the cabinet, and returned with a third plate. He set it on the table at the empty place across from Eliza. He filled it from the serving dish a full portion, more than what was left in the pot. Then he sat back down and looked at her with his direct, gray-eyed gaze. He said nothing. He did not explain or invite or make it a gesture that required anything from her in return. He simply looked at her, and then at the chair, and then back down at his own plate. Ruth looked at the chair, then at the plate. Her throat closed in a way she had not expected and could not entirely account for. She had been calculating debts and appeals and distances for 8 months, and this, a plate set at a table, was the thing that nearly undid her. She sat down. Eliza watched her with those dark, careful eyes, and then picked up her fork. The 3 of them ate supper in a silence that was, against all reasonable expectation, not uncomfortable. She worked through the first night in the office. She did not plan to. She had meant only to sort the papers into categories before bed, but once she began to understand the shape of the disorder, she could not leave it unfinished. It was like seeing a person bleeding and walking away because you were tired. The accounts were not simply disorganized. They were being actively undermined. It took her until 2 in the morning to see it clearly, and when she did, the cold that settled in her chest had nothing to do with the altitude. Caleb Aldrich's timber concern sold cut lumber to 3 buyers, a railroad contractor, a building supplier in Colorado Springs, and a man named Douglas Crane, who operated as an independent broker and claimed to represent a consortium of buyers in Santa Fe. On paper, Crane's prices were competitive. In practice, when Ruth laid his invoices beside the freight manifests, she found bundled in a crate under the desk, the weights didn't match. Crane was paying for 8,000 board feet and receiving 10. The discrepancy was not large on any single delivery. Across 18 months of deliveries, it amounted to more than $400 in lumber that had simply, quietly, vanished from the accounts. She found the second thread when she unfolded a letter from the Holtz Crossing Land Office. It was addressed to Caleb but had been buried under a stack of freight receipts, either by accident or by intention she could not yet determine. It was a notice of pending review on the northern boundary of the Aldrich timber claim, a review initiated by a complaint filed by a man named Harlan Crane, Douglas Crane's brother. Ruth sat very still in the lamplight. The boundary in question encompassed the stand of old-growth fir that represented the most valuable timber on the entire property, the trees that had not yet been felled, the trees that were the future of the concern. If the boundary review went against Caleb, that stand would fall under dispute, and a disputed claim could be tied up in the land office for years. Years during which Douglas Crane's consortium would be the logical buyer for the cheaper, cleared timber at whatever price they chose to offer. She had seen this before. She had lived it. The instruments were different, a surveyor's chain instead of freight manifests, but the architecture of the theft was identical. Find a man who is too busy working his land to watch his paper. Bleed him slowly. Then arrive as his salvation when he is finally desperate enough to sell. Her hands were perfectly steady as she uncapped her pen. She wrote until dawn. She wrote a letter to the railroad contractor in Denver, requesting a written confirmation of delivered board feet for the past 18 months, framed as a routine audit for insurance purposes. She wrote a similar letter to the Colorado Springs buyer. She wrote a careful, precise letter to the Colorado Territorial Land Office in Denver, not to the Holtz Crossing branch, requesting a copy of the original survey records for the Aldrich timber claim, as filed at the time of original purchase. She knew from her own family's experience that original surveys and amended surveys were different documents, and that the difference between them was frequently where the lie was hidden. She also began a new ledger. She rebuilt Caleb's accounts from the scattered pieces he had left her, entry by entry, her handwriting small and exact. By the time the first gray light came through the east-facing window, she had a clear picture of the Aldrich Timber Concern's actual financial position. She also had a list of every transaction involving Douglas Crane, annotated in red. When she heard Caleb moving in the room above her, she closed the ledger and went to the kitchen to build the morning fire. The days that followed found their rhythm. Ruth ran the house as she ran everything methodically, without waste, without drama. Floors were scrubbed, linens were changed. Eliza's threadbare school dress was let down at the hem, and a new collar added from fabric Ruth found in a trunk. Meals appeared on time and were better than what had come before, but the real work happened in the evenings. After Eliza was put to bed, Ruth would spread the accounts across the kitchen table, and Caleb, who had begun, hesitantly, to linger after supper rather than retreating immediately to the porch, would sit across from her and try to understand what she was showing him. He was not a foolish man. He was a man who had spent 2 years carrying a grief and a business simultaneously, letting one suffer because the other demanded everything. He learned quickly when someone took the time to explain without condescension. Ruth showed him not just what the numbers meant, but what they told that his sawmill foreman was running an efficient operation, that his lumber quality was better than what Crane's prices reflected, that he had been undervaluing himself because he had no one to tell him otherwise. He started bringing her questions. Should he hire another saw team for the north section or repair the existing equipment? Was there enough margin to replace the draft horses before winter? He was not asking for decisions. He was asking her to think alongside him. Ruth found, to her own surprise, that this was the thing she had missed most in the 8 months since her father died. Not safety, not comfort, but the simple act of being consulted by someone who intended to listen. One afternoon, almost 2 weeks after her arrival, a rider came up the track from town. He handed Ruth a sealed envelope, tipped his hat, and rode back down. Inside was a letter from the railroad contractor in Denver. He confirmed, in writing, that his records showed delivery shortfalls on 11 of the past 14 shipments. From the Aldrich concern, shortfalls he had assumed were the result of milling variance and had not previously raised, as the amounts had seemed within a reasonable margin. He included the figures. She sat at the kitchen table for a long time with that letter in her hands. Then she placed it in the new ledger, smoothed it flat, and went back to hanging the laundry. 3 days later, the reply came from the Colorado Territorial Land Office. The original survey of the Aldrich timber claim, as filed in 1881, placed the northern boundary exactly where Caleb had always believed it to be, 200 yards north of where the pending review proposed to move it. Attached was a copy of the survey record. At the bottom of the page, in a different hand, was a note indicating that the complaint initiating the review had been filed by H. Crane of Holt's Crossing. She placed that letter in the ledger as well. Douglas Crane rode up to the Aldrich house on a Wednesday morning, the kind of clear mountain morning that made the air feel scrubbed and new. He rode a good horse and wore his hat at the angle of a man who expects his arrival to be welcome. Ruth was splitting kindling at the side of the house when she heard the horse. She set down the hatchet, smoothed her apron, and walked around to the front porch before he had fully dismounted. Crane was a compact man, somewhere in his mid-40s, with the soft, careful hands of someone who made his living moving paper rather than timber. He had a smile that arrived before the rest of his face had committed to it. He looked at Ruth with the brisk, dismissive attention of a man cataloging furniture. "I'm here for Aldrich," he said, not unpleasantly. "He's in the upper section," Ruth said. "I handle the accounts and correspondence for the concern. How can I help you?" Crane's smile adjusted itself. "Is that right? Well, I appreciate that, miss, but what I have to discuss with Caleb is its business of a particular kind. Management decisions. I'd hate to trouble you with it." "I'm not easily troubled," Ruth said. Something moved behind his eyes. He reset his smile. "Well then, I'll be direct. I understand there's a boundary review pending on the north section of this claim. That kind of uncertainty, the land office, the legal costs, the time it takes, it can be a real burden for an operation this size. I'd like to make Caleb an offer. A fair one. I can take the disputed section and the current standing timber at a price that would more than cover any legal costs, and Caleb could focus his operation on the cleared sections without the headache." "How generous," Ruth said, in a tone that did not match the words at all. She went inside. She returned with her ledger and a document folded inside the front cover. She opened it on the porch railing and turned it so Crane could see the columns clearly. "This is a record of 18 months of lumber deliveries to your account, with the freight manifests matched against your payment invoices. These are the confirmed delivery records from the Denver Railroad contractor." She tapped the column and read. "The discrepancy is consistent, and it is substantial. In another context, Mr. Crane, a person might call it theft." The morning air felt very still. "And this," Ruth said, opening the second document, "is a copy of the original 1,881 survey of this property, as recorded with the Colorado Territorial Land Office in Denver. Not the Holt's Crossing branch. Denver." She let that word land where it would. The northern boundary is precisely where Mr. Aldrich has always maintained it to be. Your brother's complaint appears to rest on a survey that does not match the original record. I've taken the liberty of sending copies of both documents to the Territorial Land Office Review Board, along with a formal letter requesting that the pending review be dismissed and an inquiry opened into the discrepancy between the original and amended survey records. She closed the ledger. She held Crane's gaze without any particular expression on her face. He was the kind of man who expected women to either defer or become emotional, and she was offering him neither, which left him with nothing to push against. "Furthermore," she said, her voice still even, still polite, still absolutely unyielding, "I have calculated the value of the lumber delivered and not compensated for over the past 18 months. We will expect a draft for that amount to arrive by the end of the month. I am happy to send you the figure in writing, if that would be helpful." Douglas Crane stood very still. The smile was entirely gone now. In its place was the face of a man who had built a careful plan over years and was watching someone dismantle it in 10 minutes on a porch, with a book and a pen and the particular quiet fury of a woman who had lost too much to carefully laid plans once already. "You have no idea what you've done," he said, his voice tight. "I have an excellent idea," Ruth replied. "Good day, Mr. Crane." He stood for a moment longer, looking for the seam where he could recover this. He found none. He turned, mounted his horse with barely controlled force, and rode down the track at a speed that sent loose stones scattering into the pines. Ruth watched until the sound of hoofbeats faded. She realized her hands were trembling slightly, not from fear, but from the sustained effort of absolute stillness in the face of something that had wanted very much to make her afraid. She pressed her palms flat against the porch railing for a moment. The wood was warm from the sun. She breathed. Then she picked up the hatchet she'd left leaning against the step and went back to the kindling. Caleb came down from the upper section at dusk. He saw the horse tracks where a horse had stood and departed in a hurry, the churned-up earth. He saw Eliza on the porch step, watching him with those serious eyes. "There was a man," Eliza said. "Miss Ruth talked to him. He left fast." Caleb looked toward the kitchen window. The lamp was already lit inside, its warm light falling across the porch boards. He could see Ruth's silhouette moving past the window, steady and unhurried, as though this were any other evening. He went inside. She told him clearly, the same way she presented the accounts factually, without embellishment, without drama. Crane, the ledger discrepancy, the boundary survey, the letters she had sent. She placed the documents on the table in front of him and let him read them himself. He read for a long time. She put on coffee and waited. When he looked up, his face held something she hadn't seen there before. He was not a demonstrative man, she had understood that within the first hour of knowing him, but the expression that sat on his face now was not the controlled, managed look of a man keeping his own counsel. It was rawer than that. It was the face of a man who has been holding a weight alone for so long that he has stopped registering it as unusual, and has only now realized, in the absence of it, how heavy it was. 2 years, he said. He meant since his wife. He meant the accounts. He meant all of it. "I know," Ruth said. "The north section." He touched the survey document. "I knew it. I walked that line when I filed the claim. I knew where it was." "The record confirms it," she said. "It always was where you said." He was quiet for a moment. "The letters to Denver, the inquiry, are already sent." He looked at her across the table. The lamp between them made the shadows of the room soft, and the air between them feel close. He was a man who had learned not to ask for things, because he had learned that asking was a form of hope, and hope was expensive. But there was a question on his face now that was not about lumber or boundary lines. "Why?" he asked. And she knew he did not mean why had she sent the letters. He meant something larger than that. She thought about it honestly before she answered. "Because I have seen what this kind of theft costs a family," she said. "And because I am good at this, and you needed someone to be." He nodded slowly. This was a language he understood. The language of being good at something and putting it to use without requiring praise for the using. "Also," Ruth added, and her voice held a very small note of something that was almost levity, "they were sloppy. It offended me on a professional level." For the first time since she had arrived, Caleb Aldrich smiled. It was not a large smile, but it was genuine, and it changed his whole face. The way unexpected sunlight changes a hillside. She found that she had been waiting, without knowing she was waiting, to see it. The weeks that followed were quieter and better. The review of the north boundary was formally closed in Caleb's favor inside of a month. The inquiry into the survey discrepancy implicated not only Harlan Crane at the Holtz Crossing Land Office, but a notary in Colorado Springs who had certified the amended plat. The territory sent an investigator. Douglas Crane's business activities came under a scrutiny he had not anticipated and could not survive. The consortium in Santa Fe turned out to be largely fictional. Caleb found new buyers in Denver, 2 of them, which meant he was no longer dependent on any single contract. The rates were better. The north section could now be planned and harvested on a timeline that served the concern rather than a scheme. Ruth taught Eliza to keep a simple household ledger, entering the cost of flour and sugar and candle tallow in her careful child's hand. Eliza took to it with a focus that made Ruth think she had her father's precision and her mother's determination, which was an excellent combination for any life. In the evenings, they read together geography, mostly, because Eliza had strong opinions about places she had not yet been. Caleb watched this. He was a man who watched things carefully before he acted on them, and what he watched, over the weeks that the timber concern found its footing and the house became a home, and the silence in the evenings became a comfortable shared thing, was not the accounts or the boundary maps, or the new contracts. He watched Ruth Calloway. He watched the way she handed Eliza the pen before the girl asked for it, already knowing she would want it. He watched the way she read the land when they rode the property line together, her eyes moving across the terrain with a quiet, intent curiosity. He watched the way she argued with him about the sheep. She thought a small flock was a sensible hedge against lumber price volatility, and she was almost certainly right, and she knew it, and was perfectly willing to let him arrive at that conclusion himself, in his own time. He was arriving at another conclusion, too. It was arriving in the slow, sure way that timber grows without announcement, without drama, adding rings in the dark. It was an October evening when he said it. They were on the porch after supper, Eliza long since asleep inside. The aspens on the hillside across the valley had gone full gold, and the last of the day's light caught them and turned the whole slope into something that looked like it had been lit from within. Ruth had a wool blanket across her lap and a cup of coffee in her hands, and was watching the aspens with an expression of uncomplicated peace that he had not seen on her face in daylight, when there was always something to be attended to. "Ruth," he said. She turned to him. Her eyes in the evening light were a dark and steady amber. He was not a man who made speeches. He had thought about this moment more than he would admit, and had not arrived at any language that felt adequate. So he gave up on adequacy and offered honesty instead. "When you came here," he said, "I needed someone to manage accounts and keep the house. That was the sum of it, a practical matter." "I know," she said quietly. "It's not that anymore." He held her gaze without looking away. "Somewhere in the past 2 months, it became something I don't have a contract for, something I don't know how to put in a column and calculate." He paused. "I'm better at timber than words, but I know what I know. And I know that this," he gestured toward the lamp burning inside, toward Eliza's room, toward the porch and the valley and the slope of gold aspens and all of it. "I want this to be yours, not as employment, as home." Ruth was quiet for a moment. The aspens moved in the evening wind, and the sound they made was like water. "Is that a proposal, Caleb?" she asked. "It is," he said. "A plain one. I told you. Better at timber." She looked at him for another moment, this slow, steady, honest man who had set a plate at the table for her on the first evening and asked nothing for it. Then she reached over and placed her hand over his where it rested on the arm of the chair. "Yes," she said. He turned his hand and closed his fingers around hers, and they sat together in the last of the light while the aspens turned gold and then silver in the dusk, and did not feel the need to say anything else. The wedding was held in the little church in Holt's Crossing on a Saturday in November, 3 weeks after the aspens had lost their leaves. The town came, Henderson from the general store, who had already made his opinion known to Caleb in no uncertain terms, the sawmill foreman and his wife, the ranching families from the neighboring properties, even the woman who kept the post office, who had handled Ruth's outgoing correspondence those first weeks, and had drawn her own conclusions from the precision and the volume of it. Eliza stood beside her father in a new dress of dark green wool, her dark eyes shining with a feeling she was too careful to name, which was joy. She held Ruth's hand on the walk to the church. She did not let go until she had to. Ruth wore a dress of deep blue, simply cut, made by her own hand. In place of flowers, she carried a small sprig of Engelmann spruce she had cut that morning from the tree at the corner of the porch, a tree that had been growing at the edge of the Aldrich property since before the house was built, and would be growing there long after, steady and evergreen and rooted to the specific ground it had chosen. They said their vows in clear voices. Caleb's hands were rough from 30 years of working timber, and they held hers as though they had been built for exactly that purpose. 5 years on, the upper valley of the Aldrich timber concern was a different place than the one Ruth had arrived to. The north section had been carefully, selectively harvested, the old-growth fir managed for the long term rather than stripped. A small flock of 40 sheep, she had been right about the sheep, grazed the cleared lower meadows, tended by a young shepherd they'd hired from a family in the next valley. The second barn was finished. The house had a new room on the east side, where the morning light came in longest. Eliza, 14 now and as tall as her stepmother, sat at the kitchen table in the afternoons, doing the household ledger with an efficiency that made Ruth feel a complex mixture of pride and amusement, and something that was very close to love. A younger child, a boy of 3, with Caleb's dark hair and Ruth's determined jaw, toddled on the kitchen floor at her feet, attempting to stack kindling into some architectural design only he could see. On the porch, Ruth and Caleb sat in the long September light. His hand was on her knee and her head was tipped back slightly to catch the warmth. The ledger sat on the small table beside her, its columns neat and current and balanced to the penny, the whole account of a life well managed. "Henderson told me something last week," Caleb said. "Only one thing?" she said, without opening her eyes. That must have required considerable restraint on his part. Caleb smiled. He said Crane's brother Harlan left the territory. Went to Nevada, apparently. "Good," Ruth said simply. "He also said that people in town call you the woman who broke the Crane scheme with a pen and a ledger." He paused. "Some of them mean it as a compliment." Ruth opened her eyes and looked at the valley, at the pines stepping up the hillside in rows of deep, untroubled green, at the sky above them going the pale, clear blue of altitude and autumn. She thought of the morning she had arrived in Holt's Crossing, 41 cents in her pocket and everything she owned in a small leather satchel, calculating what she might be worth to a stranger in the mountains. She thought about Garrett Finch and his instruments and his pleasant smile. She thought about her father. She thought about the letter she had received that was worn soft at the creases from being read too many times. She reached over and found Caleb's hand. "They came after this concern," she said, "believing they could take what they wanted and leave us with the pieces. They thought we were too small, too scattered, too busy surviving to see what they were doing." She looked at the house, at the light coming through the kitchen window where Eliza was working, at the small boy, visible through the glass, still building his improbable tower. "They miscalculated," she said. Caleb squeezed her hand. 5 years' worth of mornings and evenings and hard seasons and good ones passed between them in that silence, the kind of silence that is not empty at all. "They did," he said. She had arrived asking only for a chance, a room, a wage, a place to put her considerable abilities to use in exchange for a safe place to stand. She had arrived believing that was all she had the right to ask for. What she had built instead, out of numbers and nerve, and the quiet refusal to be made small, was everything. And that is the thing about competence, about the kind of courage that never raises its voice. It doesn't announce itself. It arrives quietly. It looks at the disorder of the world, and it simply begins to set things right. What country are you listening from, friends? Drop it in the comments. It means more than you know to hear where these stories land.